Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today for an early bird program to learn about our Bird-A-Thon mascot, the red-breasted nuthatch. My name is Leash Garada, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm communications manager at Point Blue Conservation Science. I'm zooming in today from Petaluma's headquarters, or from Point Blue's headquarters in Petaluma, California, on the edge of Schollenberger Marsh, and on the unceded lands of the Coast Miwok people, the original inhabitants and stewards of this land. Coast Miwok people are still here in Sonoma County, along with other local Indigenous groups, and Point Blue is working to form partnerships with and center the needs of Indigenous groups as part of our conservation work we do now and into the future. So for those of you who are new to Point Blue, we are an environmental nonprofit founded in 1965. Our 60th birthday is next year. We were founded in West Marin County with the mission to conserve birds, other wildlife, and ecosystems through science, partnership, and outreach. We have about 160 scientists working in ecosystems throughout California, from the Sierra to the sea, from Alaska to Chile, and as far as Antarctica, to understand ecosystems and apply that knowledge to implement nature-based, inclusive solutions to climate change and biodiversity challenges. So please do explore our website at pointblue.org and follow us on social media to learn more. So today we are so excited and honored to have the author of the Red-breasted Nuthatch Birds of the World profile with us, Dr. Cameron Ghalambor. As we were preparing for this webinar, I have already learned so many new things about this crazy species, and I'm excited for you all to learn more and to get jazzed about our Bird-A-Thon, which kicks off this Sunday. We'll talk more about our Bird-A-Thon at the end of the program, but let me introduce our speaker a little bit more, and then we'll get to the presentation today. So Dr. Cameron Ghalambor is a professor at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. He's also, of course, the lead author of the Birds of the World Red-breasted Nuthatch Profile and many, many other peer-reviewed publications. Cameron considers himself an evolutionary ecologist interested in the process of adaptive evolution and the patterns of biodiversity it generates. He attempts to take an integrative approach to questions that fall at the intersection of ecology, evolution, behavior, physiology, and conservation. Dr. Ghalambor is originally from Southern California and is currently based in Trondheim, Norway, which is where he's coming in from today. He did his PhD dissertation on the red-breasted nuthatch and is about to publish a manuscript soon on the species, which you'll hear about today. He leads research also on the island scrub jay on the Channel Islands, on tropical guppies, and insects and climate change in Norway. So quite a diverse skill set and interest level. He also co-hosts a podcast called Big Biology, so you should all go and check that out. Thank you so much for being with us today, Cameron. And before I pass the mic to you, I'll encourage all of you to submit your questions via the Q&A function. I'll be turning the chat function off during the program and direct you to the Q&A function to submit your questions. Go ahead and submit them as they come up for you, and we'll circle back to them at the end of the presentation. And if you're having any technical difficulties, Point Blue's Deborah Stein is here to support you via chat. Thank you so much, Deborah, for being our support today and our lead organizer of our Bird-A-Thon event. So with that, I will pass the mic over to you, Cameron, and let you get started.
Great. Thanks, Lishka, and thank you for the invitation to speak with you all today. As despite the stereotype that it doesn't get very sunny in Norway, it's actually quite sunny. I have the sun in my face. So I'm going to just go ahead and start sharing my screen. Okay, great. All right. Well, let's learn a little bit about nuthatches. So, as Lishka mentioned, more than 20 years ago, I started working on nuthatches as part of my PhD research, and maybe like some of you, I just found them both fascinating, sort of biologically, but also there was something very endearing about nuthatches, and there was it was either something about their behavior, the way they called, the way they behaved that I just, really, yeah, you're supposed to be very objective as a scientist and not like, fall in love with your study organism, but I definitely fell in love with not just the red-breasted nuthatch, but with the group as a whole. And so today I want to tell you a little bit more about the Cetidae, the nuthatches, and then also a little bit about some of the research that we continue to do on them. So to begin, thinking about, well, what makes nuthatches sort of unique and special, and I think the probably most obvious aspect of their behavior is this ability to walk down the sides of trees. And so there's other bird species that will kind of move up tree trunks, like if you've seen brown creepers, to some extent the black and white warbler. But nuthatches are unique in that they not only can walk up trees, but they also walk down the trunks of trees. And they accomplish this partly because they have these very strong feet, and the claw that sort of runs to the back of the foot, which we call the halix, tends to be a little bit longer and more robust than other birds, and basically they kind of hang off that back halix as they're walking down the sides of trees. And one thing that ability does is it you can imagine, for example, if you were a creeper and you were going up a tree and you were probing underneath tree bark to try to find food, you would only see what kind of is exposed to you as you move up, and anything you missed, you wouldn't be able to go back down and look. And so nuthatches have this ability to go both ways, and we think that gives them a big advantage in terms of finding food within the barks of trees. And while most nuthatches are pretty small, they do come in a wide range of sizes. And so here I'm showing you one of the smallest species, which some of you may already be familiar with, the pygmy nuthatch, which is just about 4 inches long. And then almost twice as big is the giant nuthatch, which you can find in Asia, which is at 7.7 inches, is a big beefy nuthatch. And yeah, one other aspect, I guess, of their morphology is just that they tend to have relatively large heads for their body size. They tend to have short tails, and they have extremely powerful and strong bills that they use both for probing in the bark of trees for food, but also for making cavities in trees that many of the species will use for nest sites. And so if we look at the species of nuthatches that are commonly found in North America, three of the species are found in California and are probably accessible to most of you in the Bay Area or wherever you may be calling in from. And so we could start with the two smallest species, the brown-headed nuthatch and the pygmy nuthatch. So they the nice thing about North American nuthatches is they segregate very nicely by the kinds of habitats that they use. So brown-headed nuthatches are found primarily in the southeastern part of the United States. They're in what we would refer to as yellow pine kind of forests. They're interesting in that they breed cooperatively, and their counterparts in Western North America are the pygmy nuthatches. And so they're primarily found in ponderosa pine forests, but you can think of them as being a sort of a lowland, up middle elevation pine forest species. And then if you kind of leave the coniferous forests and go into the deciduous forests, so places where you have oaks and elms and other big deciduous trees, there you'll find the white-breasted nuthatch. And so it's the largest of North America's nuthatches, and it's pretty commonly found in either deciduous forests throughout the east and into the west, or mixed conifer and deciduous forest. And then finally, the red-breasted nuthatch is in California, more commonly found at higher elevations, anywhere that you have fir trees, spruce trees, um, is basically where you find the red-breasted, and their distribution really is very what we would call a boreal distribution throughout North America. So uh, they're found throughout, for example, Canada. They wrap around, they go across North America and then kind of drop down into northeastern part of the U.S. And so they have this very broad distribution within the country. And while we think of these as very sort of iconic species within North America, um, actually, they're only a small portion of the broader diversity of nuthatches around the world. So, depending on which expert you talk to, there's anywhere between 25 and 29 species, but I think most people would agree that there are about 28 nuthatch species around the world. And uh, these species tend to be primarily, nuthatches tend to be primarily forest species. And so some of these nuthatches are absolutely stunning and striking in their appearance. So you can see here the velvet-fronted nuthatch and the beautiful nuthatch and the blue nuthatch, which are found throughout or in portions of Southeast Asia. And then you have the one sort of outlier group, which are the rock nuthatches. So there's the eastern and western rock nuthatch that occur from Eastern Europe into sort of Western Asia, and they primarily occupy rocky areas, non-forested areas, and they're sort of the um, outliers as far as the other nuthatches go. And I have to confess here, I haven't seen any of these four species. I have them on my bucket list, and someday I hope to make it to to see these really stunning, beautiful birds. So, where the highest diversity of nuthatches actually occurs is within Southeast Asia. So this is a crude map from a paper that was published a few years ago showing kind of the cartoon distribution of some of these species. But we generally think that the origin of where the nuthatches sort of came from and diversified from is within Southeast Asia, within the forests between the Himalayas and um, the Indian and Indian Ocean. And so from there, it's thought that nuthatches kind of moved out into Eurasia and further north, and then across into North America. So the species that we have currently are kind of we can think of as being really the sort of the outliers relative to everybody else geographically. And if you look at the genetics in terms of how the different species are related to each other, what you find is that mostly the species that are most closely related to each other tend to be geographically also in the same area. So um, the European nuthatch is a sort of a super species that occupies uh, broad areas of northern Europe and Asia. Uh, but basically, as you kind of go to different areas, the different species tend to be more closely related to each other. but I say generally there's a tendency, but this is not necessarily always the case. And so, for example, here in North America, red-breasteds are a little bit more closely related to pygmies and brown-headed nuthatches, but the white-breasted is really distantly related. And what's particularly interesting is the red-breasted nuthatch's relationship to its closest relatives. So I mentioned earlier that red-breasteds have this very large distribution across North America. You can kind of see that in the insert map on the slide here, where they occupy this broad distribution within North America. But all of their closest relatives have really small distributions. So the Corsican nuthatch, for example, is found only on the island of Corsica. The Algerian nuthatch is only found in the um, north part of the country and in the I think it's the Atlas Mountains there. And all of these species are just these have occupy these very restricted uh, just have these very restricted distributions, and many of them are uh, threatened because they have such limited distributions. And so so why is that? We kind of hypothesize that uh, probably at the time when the red-breasted group broke off from all the other nuthatches about 2.5 to 3 million years ago, they probably occupied a very broad distribution in both North America and Eurasia. And for reasons that we don't know, all of the populations that were in Eurasia contracted into these small little pockets and basically got stuck. And so we think that they were probably much more widely distributed in the past and are now in these very small have these very small distributions. So that's kind of an interesting thing to, so why, a question that people have asked is, well, what is it about the red-breasted that's allowed it to persist and have this really large distribution when all of its other closest relatives have these shrunken distributions? So, some other kind of interesting aspects about nuthatch behavior. I mentioned earlier that the pygmy and the brown-headeds breed cooperatively, so they they usually retain one of the offspring, usually a son, that raises its siblings in subsequent years, which is kind of cool. I think as humans, we can relate to that. But they also do lots of other things. So many of us put up bird feeders, and of course, nuthatches are a very common species to find at bird feeders. And while you may think that they have endless stomachs and can eat forever, it's usually only a small fraction of the food that they collect from your feeder that they actually eat right away. Most of that food they take and they hide in little places, and we call this caching behavior. So they have these food caches that they store their food in. It's hard to get exact estimates, but some people have said anywhere from 10,000 to 100,000 food items could be cached by a single individual within a year, which is, a remarkable number. And going along with that behavior, nuthatches have this relatively large hippocampus within their brains, which is the part of the brain that's associated with memory, especially spatial memory. So, I know for myself, like if we do like an Easter egg hunt and I put out like a couple dozen eggs, I sometimes can't remember, 30 minutes later where I put all those eggs. And yet, nuthatches and other species that exhibit this type of caching behavior have amazing ability to find and locate these cached food items. So you can kind of think about it like their cupboard or their pantry, where rather than storing the food on their bodies in the form of fat, they store it in their environments, and then they use it as they need it. And sort of going along with that, we also see that many species of nuthatch have been observed using tools, so like little pieces of bark or plant material to poke or prod and get in little crevices um, to find food. And um, that's also, very notable. Oh, excuse me. Because we think of, like, what are the species that use tools? Well, humans, chimpanzees, uh, maybe a few other, like crows and other species that we think of as being particularly smart. So that's a pretty another kind of very cool behavior that they exhibit. Um, and then particularly species like the pygmy nuthatch also exhibit this behavior we call communal roosting. So in the winter, when temperatures can get quite cold, um, what pygmy nuthatches will do is gather together and roost inside of tree cavities in large groups. And it's thought that this is a strategy basically to keep warm on cold nights. And some work that's been done on pygmy nuthatches in Arizona found that as many as 100 individuals can pack into a single tree cavity on particularly cold nights. And even they've even observed that when on very cold nights when you get these really large numbers of individuals packed in, some individuals are found dead the next morning at the bottom of the cavity, presumably, crushed by the other individuals. And so this roosting behavior again is a you know kind of an interesting adaptation to probably deal with very cold temperatures. And that behavior is kind of also tied to their breeding behavior because all nuthatches breed inside of cavities. And so some species, like the red-breasted, will often, most often, excavate, like a woodpecker, their own tree cavity. So where I studied them, they only excavated their own cavities, usually in a dead fir tree. But then other species like the white-breasted nuthatch rarely excavate their own cavities and often are dependent on either natural cavities or old cavities made by like woodpeckers that they may go in and modify, but they never start one from scratch. And so this behavior even is interesting because it extends to the rock nuthatches. So they live in these very dry, rocky areas without any trees, but they've retained this desire to nest inside of tree cavities or inside of cavities themselves. So they go out into the environment and they collect mud and animal dung and hair and anything else that they can find, and they build these nests either on top of rocks or within the crevices of rocks. And the old I guess Greek philosopher Pliny the Elder even observed this behavior and suggested that maybe it was the behavior of the rock nuthatches building um, these cavities and nests that was the inspiration for humans to actually build homes. So this is a behavior that has been observed for a very long time. So that, I guess, takes me now to the red-breasted nuthatch, and I want to focus on a particular aspect of its behavior and when it breeds. So as I mentioned, it excavates uh, cavities in snags and dead trees, but it exhibits this very interesting behavior that, as far as we know, no other bird species in the world exhibits, which is that it after it builds its cavity and builds its nest inside the cavity, it then goes to live conifer trees and it collects the sticky conifer resin or sap, you might call it, and brings it back and applies it to the entrance of the nest. So I'm sure at some point, if you've ever been in a coniferous forest, you've gotten this sticky resin on your hands, and you know that it can be kind of difficult to get off. This resin is full of a lot of actually kind of nasty chemicals, these terpenes and different kinds of chemicals that um, have probably evolved inside of the conifer trees primarily to deter insects from eating on them. And so it's interesting that this bird is then it's nesting in dead trees, it's flying to live trees, and it's bringing the resin and applying it to the outside of its nests. And that creates some problems. So uh, the behavior, hopefully you can see this in the picture. The resin just continuously accumulates as they go from egg laying to incubating to feeding the nestlings to the time of the fledgling, the timing of the young fledging the nest. And to because it gets to be such a sticky environment around the outside of the nest, when parents want to come and feed their young, they typically fly into the cavity straight without perching, and the entrance to these cavities are not much bigger than the bird. So I'm still amazed, and I'm not quite sure how they fly at very high speeds and go right into the nest and somehow stop, recover, feed their young, and then fly out again. I kind of think of it as like if you can imagine like the big cannons that at a circus that somebody would be shot out of. Imagine doing the reverse and having to fly into the cavity into the cannon and somehow like stopping and not like crashing into the back of it. And that's essentially what they do. They also exhibit these other really interesting behaviors. So just as the chicks are about to leave the cavity and fledge the nest, the parents will go out and usually collect mammal fur or sometimes leaf litter, and they start to kind of create a little entry way for the chicks to sort of sit on, so they don't get the sap and the resin on them. So there's a fairly sophisticated level of sort of cognitive abilities that are going on with this behavior. And so we also know that, occasionally it's been observed that people have found dead uh, either chicks or adults stuck to this sticky resin on the outside of the boxes or of their cavities. Um, so this is a rare case where we have a cavity or a nest in a nest box here. And so this kind of motivated us to try to ask, well, what's the function of this behavior? Why are they doing this? It seems like it creates a lot of trouble, and that they have to sort of deal with. It can even occasionally be lethal. So what are the potential benefits that they might be gaining from bringing this conifer resin to the nest? And this is actually a question that's been posed by many people. And so one of the probably most obvious uh, explanations or hypotheses that's been put forward is that the resin likely deters predators that would like to get into the cavity and eat the eggs or the babies. We know that predation on nests is the primary source of mortality and death during reproduction. So any kind of behavior that parents can exhibit to deter these predators from getting into the nest, should be highly favored. And in fact, one of the inspirations for kind of studying this more was that I was watching a nest one time, a red-breasted nuthatch nest, and a red squirrel tried to get into the nest, and the parents were able to sort of scare it off. And they had been bringing resin maybe once every 45 minutes. And in the next 45 minutes, when they had deterred the squirrel, they made 76 trips back and forth, both parents bringing resin to the nest. So again, there seems to be this cognitive ability to sort of understand that the resin actually has maybe a function here to, in this case, to deter predators. Uh, but also, if you're a cavity nester, and especially one that, excavates its own cavity, um, you also have to worry about competitors because there's a lot of other species that would also like to use your cavity. And so this includes especially many bird species like bluebirds and especially house wrens and chickadees to some extent, but even like some small mammals, a cavity is a nice protected, usually warm place that is a nice home for a lot of things. And so um, once you make this cavity as your home for reproduction, you often have to defend it against these other species that would like to take it over. And so Lawrence Killam, referred to the resin as an effective bird lime against other avian and small mammal hole competitors. But there's also been this idea that, well, like I showed you with the rock nuthatches, that all nuthatches like to mess with their cavities and do things to them, and to some extent that's true. And so some people have suggested that this really doesn't have an actual function. It's just an evolutionary relic or frill that's kind of just been passed on, and we shouldn't make too big a deal about it. So, so yeah. So what is it? Does it deter predators? Does it deter competitors? Or is it just this kind of evolutionary inertia? So you can make a note to yourself of like which one you think it might be, and I'll tell you about a study that we did to try to find out the answer to that question. So this is a collaboration between myself and uh, now Dr. James Mouton, a new professor at Ohio State University, Dr. Tom Martin, who was at the University of Montana for many years, is now retired, and my longtime collaborator, Dr. Scott Sillett, who's the director of the Migratory Bird Center at the Smithsonian Institution. So, how would you test this hypothesis? Well, first we had to go to a place where there was a lot of red-breasted nuthatches, and so we carried out this research in central Arizona, at the top of the Mogollon Rim, which is the edge of the Colorado Plateau, so at about 8,000 feet, where you have a nice mix of white fir and uh, white fir, Doug fir, and a little bit of spruce. And so we did some experiments where we took nest boxes that we built and we put them out into the forest every 50 meters, and we put them out in pairs, and half of the boxes we applied about an eighth of a teaspoon of resin every 3 days, which is about what we estimated the birds to be doing as well. And so we were using a little popsicle stick to do as an applicator. Of course, the birds are using their bills, and we did this originally back in 1998 and 1999, and then I forgot to update this slide. We did it again in 2016 and 2017, and we were interested then in seeing how much other birds would use these boxes. Would birds like chickadees and house wrens that don't build their own cavities, would they choose to use these uh, boxes with and without resin equally? Would they avoid the boxes without resin or with resin? And if they did use the ones with resin, how would they deal with it? And so, this kind of gives you a sense of like what the nest boxes look like. And, here's a sort of a close-up, not so great picture of the resin. So what did we find? Well, basically nobody nested in the boxes with resin. They always got avoided, and we saw nest material accumulate in the nest boxes without resin, and more nests, meaning eggs, were laid and initiated within those boxes. Interestingly, we had one box with resin where a pair of house wrens started to breed. So they started to bring some nest material, and they attempted to do this for about 4 days, and then they abandoned. And then they moved to the box without the resin. And when we looked closer at the box with resin, we found some house wren feathers stuck to the outside of the nest box. And so it sort of helped give us some confidence in sort of interpreting the results as, this seems to do a pretty good job to um, deter competitors. Um, but then what about predators? How how could we better test that? Well, um, there wasn't a lot of incentive for predators to go into these boxes. We were really targeting the other bird species. And so to kind of focus more on predation, we went to um, these red squirrel middens. So this is where red squirrels have their sort of caches of cones and food that they store. And we put the boxes there, and this time we baited the boxes with food. So kind of a combination of peanut butter, tuna, and peanuts, which we figured out was a fairly irresistible cocktail of food for a red squirrel. And then again, we did the same kind of experiment where we applied the resin and we checked the boxes every few days. And then we monitored to see whether the squirrels would go into the boxes and eat the food. And kind of like the first experiment, we found the resin was a very effective deterrent. So the boxes that had the resin were less likely to be enlarged and the entrances chewed on by squirrels, and as a result, they ended up removing a lot less food from those boxes. So so we think that this behavior is not just an evolutionary relic, but it actually has an adaptive function. It seems to deter competitors. It seems to deter predators based on kind of the results that we found. And these these results are kind of interesting. So for a number of different reasons. So, you know, we still have some questions about whether it's the sort of mechanical, sticky properties that's the primary deterrent, or if it's the nasty chemicals that are inside of these resins, or if it's some combination of the two that is, acting as a deterrent. And so while these results we think are really interesting and for us very fascinating because we're interested in birds and bird behavior, they also have some kind of broader implications because um, we know that a lot of other animal species, particularly insects, acquire chemicals from their diets, and they use these chemicals often to make themselves kind of toxic or to produce toxins that help them with their survival. But this type of behavior tends to be very passive. It's something that they acquired through their diet. They have to eat the food anyways. They're not actively going and collecting these food items or this resin in the case of the red-breasted nuthatches. So it's a bit more sophisticated, and there aren't many other animals that take advantage of these types of secondary chemical products that plants produce. The exception, of course, being humans. So, if you think about many of the drugs, the medicinal properties of many of the plants that we know of. These are derived from different plant species, I think in this way, the nuthatches are very much like the sort of, you know, pharmaceutical entrepreneurs of the animal world. They see that these conifer trees produce this particular substance. It helps the plants in a certain way, and they're able to exploit and take advantage of it, um, to deter competitors and predators. And so, we don't have a lot of other examples like this. Chimpanzees may eat certain foods when they're not feeling good, but really, aside from humans, it's a very rare kind of behavior. And so we think that's pretty cool. So anyways, thanks for listening. I hope you learned a little something about nuthatches. I'm happy to answer any questions today. And if you want to send me an email, if you have other questions, I'm always happy to answer them. So thanks.
Yay! Thank you so much, Cameron. That was awesome. We actually do have two questions in our Q&A box. So I'll go to the first one from Anna C. Schiffer. Anna C. would like to know, would the resin provide antibacterial properties for the nest as well?
Yeah, so probably. I would think that some of the terpenes in particular might have some antimicrobial or antibacterial properties. Um, how the guppy or the nuthatches might directly benefit from that, it's not 100% clear. They probably do get some in their diet. They certainly ingest some of it, because it gets on their bills. I forgot to mention that they will sometimes use a little tool, a little piece of bark as like a paintbrush or applicator, which is also very cool. But yeah, we don't know. It would be really interesting to explore that more.
Awesome. Thank you. And then Delaney Ortiz asks, was it possible that the boxes without resin were inhabited because they had less regular human presence? Asking about
Well,
the control.
yeah,
Yeah.
really, really good question. We tried to make the visitation rate at both boxes exactly the same. So the boxes that didn't have resin, we visited at the same time. We hung around them in the same way. We just didn't actually apply resin with our little popsicle sticks.
hmm Yeah, really great question. Good one, Delaney. And then from Kate Schroeder, just for fun, what's your favorite nuthatch and why?
Well, as I mentioned, there's all these nuthatches out in the world that I would love to see. I showed you some pictures of them, but yeah, the red-breasted is my spirit animal. I don't have a tattoo. I feel like I'm the only person in the world that doesn't have one. But if I were to get a tattoo, it would be of a red-breasted nuthatch on me. Probably, probably walking head down my thigh or something, or my calf.
Oh yeah, for sure. Amazing. Another question from Anna C. Are nuthatch eggs/nests ever threatened by insects? She's saying she could see the resin acting as a successful blocker of insects, in particular like ants.
Yeah, that's a great question, and other people have asked me that question in the past as well. Both to we think, of course, it should, and probably if we repeated these experiments, we might go somewhere like near an ant colony and do the same kind of experiment where we bait the nest with food to test that. And if you're a budding scientist, maybe you could do that experiment. It'd be very straightforward and easy, I think. Um, but some other people have also suggested that maybe the sticky resin actually catches food, and then
Hmm.
the nuthatches could eat them. I,
Hmm.
I it's possible. I've looked at a lot of nests. I've never saw if it is a source of food, with insects like the resin acting like flypaper, it's probably not a lot.
Hmm.
Um, it's probably not worth the trouble. There's probably easier ways to catch your catch your lunch.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I imagine you might have caught some evidence in your observations when you were talking about the squirrel and observing that. You mentioned like the nuthatches were coming every 45 minutes, and there was several bouts of that. And I was like, wow, he was observing that for a long time
Oh yeah,
out
I spent
there.
hours and hours. Yeah, no, so that was a really pivotal moment because I remember that day because I'd been watching the parent behavior, so I'd been watching for like 45 minutes. There was just the single trip, and then I became aware that there was also a red squirrel that was also watching the nest. So same way I was recording how often the parents were coming to the nest to feed their young. Um, then the squirrel attacked, and people have noted this other interesting aspect of nuthatch behavior, which is they will open their wings and stick their head up and then sort of almost go into like a trance-like state and wave their wings. And if you look underneath, it kind of can look like they have these eye spots. Whatever it does, it scares squirrels and chipmunks away. And it was the squirrel ran away, and then all they did for the next 45 minutes was back and forth, just bringing resin to the nest. So, yeah, I
Wow.
think it was 76 times. So it went from 1 to 76 in the
As
same,
the trigger of that interaction.
that
Yeah.
was the trigger.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, everybody, you have lots of behaviors to look for when you're out there birding on your birdathons or whenever. This is really cool. I want to go find a nuthatch exhibiting that behavior. Cheryl asks, how do they transport the resin without getting it all over their bills?
Yeah, so when they do bring it, it's usually just right at the tip of the bill, like a little tiny drop. And then when they apply it, they kind of wipe their bill, and then after they'll do several bill wipes, and then sometimes they'll kind of go off to the side and wipe their bill a little bit more. Um, but then other times they will use a little piece of bark and then use the bark kind of like a paintbrush. The same way we were using a popsicle stick, they use this little, piece of bark to apply the resin. So, yeah, yeah, it's but again, as I mentioned, I think they do probably have to, it probably they probably do swallow it occasionally on some occasions, and that it's I don't think very good for them.
Right. The risk. They'll take that over the benefit of the other things that you're finding. Yeah. We've got a question from Karen Velas. Hummingbirds struggle with getting their bills glued together with eucalyptus sap. We found this at banding stations. All right, so we've got a
Mm.
bird banding biologist in the crowd here. Do the nuthatches have any issues with getting their bills stuck from the resin? So good follow-up question there.
Yeah. So again, they do try to, I think, minimize how much um they kind of carry it in their bills. I've never seen um a nuthatch kind of with its bill sort of stuck
Yeah,
shut by the resin. But having said that, I mean, I think it certainly is a possibility, if they accidentally got too much on. I think like for the hummingbirds, eucalyptus aren't really native to
exactly. Yeah.
North America, so it's kind of a novel, new kind of problem that they have to kind of deal with.
Right. The relationship between nuthatches and their resin is probably much older and
Hmm.
something that they evolved with, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, good question. From Catherine Hickey, has anyone arranged cameras viewing inside the nest to see how the nuthatches stop so suddenly within the nest? That was a question I had too.
Yeah, no, this is something I would love to do. Maybe somebody out there knows someone who's you know got fancy camera equipment and could figure out a way of drilling a hole, on the backside of the cavity. I mean, I've thought about it. I just don't have like the technological skills to know how to do that properly. But absolutely would love to know, how do they tuck their wings, and like from a flight perspective, how do they put the brakes on so quickly? In my mind, they should fly in and they're like a cartoon. They should just like get their
Yeah.
bill stuck in the back of the tree
Yeah.
and like get knocked out and like wake up and then, fly back out again.
And I mean, I'm sure you have delved into the research to see if somebody has done that. And if you haven't found it, it probably hasn't been done yet.
No, I don't think it's
So,
been done. Yeah. So
all
again,
right. Researchers out there. Yeah.
these are things that you don't have to be a college professor to do these kinds of things. You might need to get some permission from certain agencies, but
Right, right,
yeah.
right. Yes, that's always good. All right, last question before we wrap up here. Another great question from Anna C. What is something you notice in general in forest, nuthatch related or other, when staying in one place for long periods of observation? Not many people see one spot in nature change like that throughout the day. You probably witnessed some really cool things.
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was really privileged. I mean, at the time, it didn't always feel that way. Getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning every day and hiking into the forest and setting up a blind and trying to stay awake, putting your binoculars on nests and just staying fixated. But um, I did come to really appreciate all of the really interesting behaviors that I saw, and um, I guess the thing that really one of the things that really kind of was impressed upon me was how in tune the birds are to their environments,
Hmm.
and so you really see that by through their behavior. So for example, if a squirrel calls, they are paying attention. If a Stellar's jay calls, they're they know exactly where that jay is. And a lot of the research that I did back then was playing sounds and putting up taxidermic mounts of squirrels and other birds and playing vocalizations and seeing how they change their behavior. And it's not just, so like they're paying attention to things like predators, but they're also, if another bird calls, they're also sort of eavesdropping on what other birds are doing. And in the time since, it's been shown that, like, especially birds that form flocks very much pay attention to each other, and in species like chickadees, they understand the language, the sound, the song calls and sounds that chickadees make are understood by other species like nuthatches. So they have, for example, a specific call for a squirrel, and a chickadee could give that call, and a red-breasted nuthatch will respond. There'll be a specific call for a Stellar's jay, which is another predator, and they so again, that's really
Wow.
amazing, because that's
Yeah,
like, you know you speak English and another species speaks, Spanish, and you understand Spanish because it helps you in this
right.
case. So nuthatches understand chickadee and
Yeah.
probably vice versa. And so,
Huh.
yeah, that kind of interconnectedness, I think, you really see just evidence for that on a daily basis when you sit and just watch for long periods of time.
Wow.
So yeah, I'm kind of thankful for that.
Yeah. Awesome. That is so cool that through your observations, you've detected the sounds, like you've identified some of the bird language.
Yeah.
You've seen that. So that's really cool. Another thing we can all practice out there in the woods or marshes or wherever we are. What sounds are the birds responding to, and what are they connected to in their environment? Well, thank you again so much, Cameron, for joining us today. And thank you all for joining us today. This was such an educational presentation, so motivating to learn even more and maybe even add to the research. I hope that you all learned a little bit more about nuthatches and birds, and hope you became a little bit more nuts about nuthatches and are now pumped to get involved with our bird-a-thon. The nuthatch, of course, red-breasted nuthatch is our mascot this year. For now, you know even more reasons why it's a proper mascot and should be celebrated. So we'd love for you to join us as a counter or supporter. The Bird-a-thon runs from Sunday, September 15th through October 15th. All you have to do is go to pointblue.org/birdathon and you'll find information. You'll find even we've got a video about what a birdathon is this year, thanks to Deborah. You'll have questions and contacts, and you'll even find a link to red-breasted nuthatch merch created by our own Mike Mahoney, who created a lino cut a block print of a red-breasted nuthatch. It's gorgeous, so that's on our t-shirts this year. And you can also join our kickoff event this Sunday from 9 to 10. I'll be hosting that, and we'll just be birding together for an hour virtually, and I'll be sharing tips and tricks about birding and bird-a-thon, so you can learn more there. So yeah, and if there's anything else you want to share about bird-a-thon, you can go ahead and put that in the chat, Deborah. Thank you so much for being our organizer of the bird-a-thon. We really appreciate all your work. Again, thanks everybody. Thank you, Cameron. Hope to stay connected. We'll be sharing this recording out. So if you want to watch it again or share it with your friends, we'll be posting that on our website and social media soon. So thank you so much, and
Thank
good
you.
birding, everybody.
Yep. Thanks.